They popped into my room at night, the ETs, and they were the grays, the typical grays that you hear about. And they said that they needed my help with my daughter. My daughter? I didn't know what they were talking about, and yet it didn't feel completely foreign to me. Leading up to that, I knew that I never wanted to have children. So I decided to have a tubal ligation, and my older sister told me, just wait till you're 30 because that's when your maternal instinct will kick in. So I waited until I was 30, and my 30th birthday present to myself was to have a tubal ligation. Probably less than 2 weeks after that, I was home on a Sunday, lying on my bed reading a book, and 3 extraterrestrials, 3 alien beings, popped into my bedroom. And I could only see them from here on up. It's like they didn't have bodies, but they had chests, and it was 2 males and 1 female. And I could tell they were very upset with me, and I wasn't sure why. But when they popped into my room, they paralyzed me, and I was unable to move my body. I could shift my eyes, but I couldn't move my head, couldn't move my body. And they flipped me over, lifted me up from behind, and did an exam on me. And they were talking to each other telepathically, and I could understand everything that they were communicating, and they were upset that I had had this tubal ligation. They thought that they were now unable to have access to my eggs. And what they realized with the examination, that I still had the eggs, they just weren't able to go down the fallopian tube. So then they were fine, and they left just as quickly as they showed up. Yeah, I questioned my sanity, and yet I knew it was real. I was there and witnessed it, and I went to a couple of very close friends, and at the time I hadn't gone public yet as a psychic medium. So they didn't know that I had that ability, and I told them my story, and I could tell that they were questioning my sanity, just like I was, wondering if we could still be friends. Who else could they tell? And me being able to tune into those thoughts, what it told me is, shut up. It's not safe to tell anybody because you're going to be judged. And I wasn't up for that. So I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to talk to. I finally started doing some research, and I came across Dr. Jack Kasher. He was the head physicist at UNO, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, but he was also the head field investigator for MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. I called him up, scared to death, and asked for an appointment, and he was gracious enough to give me some of his time. I went to see him, and I was so nervous because, first of all, what if he believed me? What if he didn't believe me? It was equally terrifying to me. And I told him my story, and he believed me. He also said it was probably not an isolated incident. And that, I couldn't even go there at the time. It's just, I was still trying to deal with, the one thing that happened to me. But I was so grateful to him. And he told me about a support group that existed in Omaha. And I thought, a support group? There's more than me that these things have happened to? And so I went to the support group and walked in and saw people just like me, who had experiences, who had contact, and a lot of it in different ways. But many of them the same way with me, that there was an interest in breeding, in taking my eggs, in making me be what I call a lab rat, basically. It just gave me great peace of mind. Then they told me about a symposium that was happening in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is 45 minutes away from me. And I thought, I didn't know UFOs existed. I didn't know extraterrestrials existed. And here are other people with experiences. There's a symposium 45 minutes away from me on UFOs. I couldn't believe it. So I went to the symposium, and one of the speakers was Linda Moulton Howe, who is a UFO investigator, and mostly with cattle mutilations, but she's dedicated her life to investigating and making films about UFOs. She had opened up for questions at the end of her talk, So I was lucky enough to be chosen, and I told her about my experience. And the first thing she said is, this probably isn't an isolated incident. I didn't know what to do. I was just grateful that she believed me as well. Someone that had made this her life. So after the symposium was over, I started doing some research. While the research happened, downloads started to happen. For those who aren't familiar with what a download is, it's like someone gives you the dictionary or gives you an encyclopedia and inserts it in your head and said, here you go. And that's what the downloads were to me. And they would happen during a corporate business meeting. They would happen while I was just sitting at home watching TV. One time it happened while I was taking my morning walk. And this download came to me, which was that not only had they been contacting me regularly, but it was last night that I'd had a major contact. And I had been regularly been taken on crafts and been exposed to examinations. And these memories of me being on gurneys and being wheeled around with dozens and dozens and dozens of other people that they had taken and lined up. There were doctors there doing exams on me. And it's terrifying to have all this happen at once. This was not a stream of consciousness. It was like, here you go, here's what's happening. And can you imagine being in a corporate business meeting and have something like that be downloaded to you and have to act normal? The downloads were happening on a fairly regular basis. And what would happen is at night, I would go to bed and get ready to go to sleep, and there would be a shift in the energy, and I knew that that was going to be a night that I was going to be taken, and I would have stark terror, and then boom, I would be gone, and I would be on a craft. And I remember one night I was so angry that I shook my fist and I said, were you born in a barn? Can't you people knock before you enter? So a couple of weeks later, in my head, I hear, and boom, there they were, and I was off on a craft. The thing is that stark terror would come at night, but in the morning I wouldn't remember any of it until the downloads would happen. And these downloads continued for decades until my next conscious encounter. They took me on a craft and they put me in a room that, the way I describe it, is about the size of a normal bathroom in a home. But it was very sterile. It was like stainless steel and white. And they set me on a kind of a bench, a stainless steel bench, and they brought in this little girl. They told me that she was experiencing failure to thrive. So she was basically on her deathbed. They put her in my arms, and every maternal instinct that I didn't think I had kicked into gear. And I held her. I kissed her. I talked to her. I bonded with her. This is difficult for me to talk about to this day. And she was my little girl. And I knew it with every fiber of my being. And the longer I held her and the more I connected with her, I physically could see color come back into her face. I could tell she was healthy. The grays came back in to get her. And I thought, how can I let her go? This is my daughter. How can I let her go to these emotionless beings? And I thought, they have no emotion towards her, but she has emotion towards them. It's the only life form she's ever really known. And she just kind of jumped off my lap and scampered over to them. And I had to let her go. I said, I did my job. And I saved her. How do you reconcile that? How do you make sense of that? To this day, I'm still doing it, and it's probably been, I don't know, 15 years, maybe longer than that. And every day I think about her. Every day I wonder how she is. In order to help me come to terms with what has happened to me, I knew probably the next best thing was for me to go with hypnotherapy. I just didn't know who to go to. I didn't know who was qualified to work with something that was so out there. One day I enrolled in a Reiki class, and I'm sitting waiting for the teacher to arrive, and she walked in, and I went, oh, it's her. And I recognized her on a soul level, and that we'd probably had lives together before. And she said that she'd just come from a hypnosis session and that they were way out there. And I had no idea she was a hypnotherapist. I thought she was just my Reiki teacher. So after the class, I contacted her and made an appointment to start hypnotherapy with her. And I have to say, I was so nervous with that first session. Because again, what if it's true? What if it's not true? It was equally terrifying to me that I'd made all this up, I was crazy, or this stuff really did happen to me. It came out that I was part of a breeding program. So that's what this group was constantly taking me, taking eggs and growing fetuses, because sometimes I'd feel pregnant, then I wouldn't feel pregnant, and there was just so much damage done to the inside of me that I had to have a hysterectomy at a relatively early age. And even the doctor was surprised at how much damage was inside of me. But it clarified that, yes, I had had contact with extraterrestrials. In fact, since the age of 5. I was in the hospital and with a fever of, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was enough where they had to put me in an ice bed and feed this cold orange soda to me to help me bring down my temperature. And at one point, I remember being paralyzed. And again, I could move my eyes, but I couldn't move anything else. And the nurse that was with me, because I was in intensive care, so there was somebody with me at all times, she was paralyzed too. And I thought, something feels weird, something feels funny. And this doctor walked into the room. And I just remember his white lab coat. He had a stethoscope hanging out of the lower pocket on the right side, and it was so bright. This was the middle of the night. The lights were not on. There was no ambient light from the hallways, and yet this stethoscope was blinding me. I thought, what is it reflecting off? Even as a 5-year-old, it didn't make sense to me. And this doctor came over right here on my right side and told me I would always be safe and always be protected. I thought, well, why wouldn't I be safe and protected? I'm a 5-year-old girl from a loving home. And he didn't really do much else to me but comfort me and left. Well, under hypnosis, under that first session, it was a gray, it was an ET who had camouflaged himself, projected himself to look like a doctor. And there were two other ETs on my left side, which consciously I don't remember that at all, but I do remember this doctor. I do remember being very, very sick. And the next day, my parents came to visit me, and my doctor said, we almost lost her last night. She almost died. And I didn't know that piece of it till I was probably in my 40s. My mom told me that I'd almost died that night. I thought I was just in the hospital and I was sick. So I do question today whether the ETs came and they were the ones that saved me, or they just reassured me that I would always be safe and always be protected. So I have had contact from the age of 5. In one of the hypnosis sessions, because I'd been through several of them at this point, was that I had a soul agreement with the extraterrestrials to participate in this breeding program. And I do remember in one of the downloads that I said, I don't want this anymore. I want this to stop. And they showed me a contract and said, look at your signatures here. You signed it. You agreed to this. And I thought, well, I'm a woman of my word, so I guess, okay, I'm stuck with this. Well, what came out in hypnosis is that we can break these contracts. They're soul contracts. We can break them. And I said, this contract is null and void. I'm aware of universal law, and you must stop if I say so. And to my knowledge, I have never been contacted by that particular group again. So I broke the contract with the Greys. But in the meantime, a couple of years before I did that, had been contacted by an additional group that I like to call the technological group. They came to me one night. I didn't have the same terror that I did with the Greys, but I had a download later of being on a different kind of a craft where there were like tables, rounded tables like this. It was like the cockpit of a craft, but it was huge, absolutely huge. And I was the lone person sitting at one of these long tables, and a being who said he was my teacher, and he looked very Egyptian to me, looked very human, but I knew he wasn't. He said, "Kristi, come on over here. It's time to do some programming." And I was acting like a petulant child, going, you know I hate programming. You know I'm not technological. And he's just like, "Get over here." So I stood up and went over to this wall, this bank of computers, and something was triggered in me, and I just started pushing buttons and doing these very advanced programs technologically. And I how do I know how to do this? Nobody was more shocked than me. And I practiced and practiced and practiced until my teacher was satisfied. And I was just like, I couldn't believe what I was able to do, because that certainly is not a skill set that I have here in human form. Then he brought me over to another wall and started showing me holographic images. And there were fires burning and chaos and people running and screaming. And he said, "These are the people you're going to save." I said, "How do I do that? I've never saved anybody. I've never been in a fire. I don't know what to do." And I said, "What about my family?" He said, "Someone else is in charge of your family. This is who you're in charge of." I went, "Okay. What am I going to..." He said, "You'll know what to do when the time is right." And what I've consistently found is that is a message that a lot of contactees get, is you'll know what to do when the time is right. So I started speaking publicly about my experiences to little tiny metaphysical groups, because I wasn't quite brave enough to go public. The response I got is what helped build the support group. And then I decided to write my book, We Are Not Alone, My Extraterrestrial Contact. To date, this is the most courageous thing I've ever done. And I didn't write this book for people who love to read books. I wrote it for people who have had contact and, just like me, had nowhere to go and nobody to talk to. The last thing I wanted to do is I contacted MUFON, and after some vetting, I am now the contact person for the state of Nebraska for MUFON. And there are field investigators, and so whenever anybody spots a craft, they will call MUFON and they'll get directed to a field investigator. But if someone has had an experience, a contact with an alien, and they call MUFON, then they are directed to me. So I deal with the contactees. So that, and I have to wonder sometimes if I'll know what to do when the time is right, and the people I'm going to save, it might not be a fire that I saw. It might be people who have had contact and just need somebody to talk to. They need a place to go, and they can find me through my book, through MUFON, through the support group. You're not alone. We're not alone. We're in this together.